So a lot of the time what I'm seeing is disconnection and disempowerment in really maddening ways. These two pictures here, I'm sure a lot of you will have seen Avril Payton's fabulous picture, A Window in the West, I think it is, isn't it, of Glasgow. That beautiful, warm, cooled-in kind of feeling of a tenement. When I came across the water from Belfast in 1973, that's not quite how it looked. I guess many of you might remember Glasgow then. It was black. It was, if you'd come from a terraced house background, as I did in Northern Ireland, it was scary. Because these were massive, high-looking, black fronted buildings with a tiny entrance like an anthill. And I can remember at the age of 13, having just lost both my goldfish on the Antrim Princess coming across the water, being infinitely more scared when we came through Glasgow and saw these huge black kind of buildings. However, this today, many of you may have heard me boring on about the tenement, is one of the great inheritances of Scotland. It gives density, it gives reasonable density to cities. It makes them manageable. It is the reason I think Glasgow and Edinburgh are constantly in the top 10 of European cities when some of our colleagues down south ain't. The origins of the tenement may not be covered in glory. It could well have been because the fuming system meant that building up gave a developer more cash than simply building one story. So it may have been motivated badly. There is no doubt that it caused overcrowding. And there is no doubt that that then connected up with poverty in the minds of many people. But there's no doubt that that level of density, 4 to 5 up, 6 up, is the ideal type for cities across the world. If you look at the history, you'll find Egypt had tenements. You find all sorts of connection with tenements. Once you begin to look at it this way, and once you go to European cities, and I'm sure many of you will have found this, you find you're almost looking at Glasgow or Edinburgh. You're looking at tenements. You're looking at yourself. And then you have to realise England is the odd one out. You know, the front and back door terrace is the unusual housing type. Well, what does it matter? The tenements that we have could be phenomenal. They are already good ways to live for cities. But if we understood how incredibly good they are for providing density, we'd fight for them. We'd fight for them the way that Dutch and German cities do, by requiring people to be able to build gardens on the top of the roof gardens on tops of tenements, trying to do something with the back courts instead of having sort of hopeless no man's lands of dunnies and bins. We would, perhaps like the Germans, have a ratio, only the Germans, where for every certain amount of building you must have a play park for children, non-negotiable. If we understood what we happen to have in Scotland and weren't so busy watching blasted location, and learning that the way value is demonstrated in our society these days is having a big sofa visible through a big window on whatever facing wall it is near your car of a semi, we would understand the jewel that we have inherited and we'd fight for it. The next point, if we had cooperatives, we'd also have a revolution in housing overnight. Again, here are two very similar sorts of buildings. The difference with a Copenhagen tenement is that this is a cooperative where everybody has bought into the cooperative. Technically they own it, but they pay low contributions to be able to own their house. Once they're part of the cooperative, they can shuttle around. If they have wings, they can move to a 2-3 apartment flat. They don't need to leave the cooperative. The cooperative also provides a ceiling so that house price inflation has not been nearly as bad in Denmark as it has elsewhere. But crucially, and this is what I couldn't get over, these are retrofitted 2-person lifts that you're seeing on the back. I hope you can see this well. And these are exactly the same type of buildings. What they've done is take the back window out of each tenement landing, and they've put a door in, and that in one fell swoop means older people can live on any floor of a tenement. We have 579,000 tenements. It's worth thinking about. It would be worth it for sure, but it needs to occur to central authorities before we can act. If we were a bit more like our Nordic neighbours, we would be making those decisions tenement block by block, cooperative by cooperative. In fact, it would be a done deal. We wouldn't be sitting waiting for somebody else to help us do the most important thing in our lives, which is to make our own housing work. So this strikes me as being one of the most serious aspects of difficulty here. And one of the heroes in all of this that I met last year, this is Muriel Alcorn and Phil Welsh from West Whittleborough Cooperative. Now, how many people here have heard of West Whittleborough? Is Muriel here? Right, Muriel, nice one. I haven't, I'll be honest. It's an area bordering South Lanarkshire near Rutherglen in Glasgow. And Muriel, I know, will be first to correct me if I get any of the dates wrong. But in the late 1980s, there was a tranche of money. West and East Whittleborough might have been improved. West Whittleborough had been thrown up in the 60s, mostly high-rise flats. The verandas were leaking, the windows weren't properly fitted. In certain wind directions, it was Baltic, the classic sort of public housing that Scotland did very badly at that period. And it became apparent that all the refurbishment money was going to go to East Whittleborough because it was easier to fix. It was low rise, it was going to be easier to fix, and West Whittleborough could just swivel. And when the guys realised this, it's not a pleasant moment when you realise that you've just been basically put on hold indefinitely. It's also not an easy thing to think about doing because, after all, everyone had been tenants. And everyone's parents had been tenants. And if you look through Scottish history, the degree to which all of us have got ancestors who have been tenants, not just in council houses, but before that on the land, we haven't got a firm grip of ownership. We have a very, very different profile of housing ownership than south of the border. We only got to 50% home ownership towards the late 90s. That's quite a different situation. And in the 1970s, Scotland was building more public housing than the Soviet Union per head of the population to make up for the deficiencies of private housing. So this is important to understand because it helps explain why, when it looks possible to grab an opportunity, it's hard for people to act because they're taking with them all of the expectations of many generations. Who the hell do you think you are? Owning your own house, fixing your own estate. In Whittleborough, you, I. And talking to Phil and Muriel, it was brilliant hearing, quite honestly, the misgivings some people had. I think actually the first time that the option to buy out the estate became apparent, there was only a 60% take-up rate, and Phil, for one, thought that wasn't good enough and had to go round and beef it up till it was in the high 70s. Because that was a big moment to do something as bold as that. And yet when you go now and see what has been achieved, it is quite extraordinary. I think I wasn't smart enough to find a very good picture of East Whittleborough, where I was taken over to, which is still run by the council. There was a problem of people chucking out old furniture, of it not being collected, and of lads perhaps setting fire to it, and on one occasion they nearly endangered the lives of some old people in a flat. So the breakthrough, brilliant idea was to have a bit in the middle of the square with furniture pick-up place written on it in paint, so you could dump all your old furniture there, and if it was set on fire, nobody would be killed. That's progress. In the way they do it in West Whittleborough, phone up the Janny will come round and remove the stuff, it will get locked away in a space, the council will be contacted, nothing lying around, no fire hazard, no hassle, contact, which is the key point, and connection, which is what makes it worth getting up in the morning. Now these guys don't want to, they do want to blow their own trumpet, why should they not? And they don't, because they're not from the Susan Morrison School of superlatives. They're quietly trying to get on with their jobs. They're trying to get on with their lives. But of course they have to justify the slightly higher management costs their cooperative now has. But the CCTV that they've put in, which again, many liberals might think, CCTV everywhere, is that a good thing? Well, yes, if it saves 11 lives by catching people with epileptic fits, catching people who've fallen, and monitoring potential drug use so you don't tend to have too many drug dealers on the estate. In all sorts of ways, West Whittleborough has become a sort of urban egg to me. Indeed, it was there first. But what it's doing is it's happing people in. And the Jannies who have got a kind of nerve centre where they see all the cameras are there 24 hours a day. Lovely guys. They'll go up and speak to an old person if they're just a bit not feeling very well, if they can't sleep, whatever. And that too stops the outrageous situation we have at the moment, where something like $2 billion was spent admitting old people 3 years ago who didn't have a clinical problem. They just didn't have anyone to connect with. That could be happening. That kind of smart, cooperative thinking could be happening all over Scotland. And indeed, I was astonished when I went through the figures to find that Glasgow Housing is a cooperative, if you like, a community-run housing capital of the UK. Did we know we had this in our midst? This is a phenomenal achievement, and part of what also has happened is we don't know. I don't know how many times when I worked for the BBC, I tried to put forward programmes around things like this that I found interesting, thought we should know about. It was tough, didn't get on, not interesting, not mainstream, just inspiring. It just changes your idea of what might be possible in this country. And ironically, after I came and saw Muriel and Phil O'Rourke a wee bit in Scotsman about it, picked up by David Cameron in number 10, who phoned, I think, and invited West Whittleborough to apply for a Big Society Award. I think Phil, particularly as a former communist, was pretty stunned at that. And I note that he didn't make a trip down to London to collect it. Did anyone notice in Scotland? Is it relevant for us? Of course it's relevant for us. And yet, professionals will scour the planet looking for the single silver bullet that will try to turn what seems to be perceived as a hopeless bunch of people living in large housing estates into something manageable, when all the time the answer is sitting in the people themselves. And how often do places like West Whittleborough have to quietly do away, quietly saving lives, quietly making lives worthwhile, over 2 decades before somebody notices they're there? So, a big round of applause for Muriel, because she was